actually very humbled to be allowed to do this because you guys are our heroes. We've been working with special needs kids for 32 years. And we feel like you guys should be up here and we'll be down there listening to you because you're really the experts. You're the ones that have been tempered in the furnace. You're the ones that really know what you're doing and have remained spiritual this whole time. And, so we just want you to know how deeply we appreciate you, everything you do, everything you've done, and everything you've been through. We admire you greatly. And it's one of the things that keeps us working in our office, is we have parents of special needs kids who are inspiring, who inspire us. If that wasn't the case, we would have gotten exhausted long ago and given up. But we learn from you as much as you could learn from us. So we deeply appreciate this opportunity. So the three groups we're going to talk about tonight: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and mood disorders. Why we picked them when there are so many other childhood disorders in the world? There's tons more, which you probably already know. There's behavior disorders like conduct disorders, oppositional defiant disorders. There's anxiety disorders. There's a plethora of childhood disorders we could talk about tonight. We picked these three areas because whenever we do a parenting workshop, those are the most often the parents that come up to us and say, I appreciate everything you said, but our child has fill in the blank, and it's usually one of those three. So it's just parenting these kids with special needs defies, like I said, it's not an exact science. It defies normal parenting strategies, doesn't it? I mean, I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. This is not your run-of-the-mill parenting situation, is it? Not only are your kids different from normal kids, but even among the populations we're talking about, there's differences in intelligence, differences in temperament, differences in mood and adjustment ability, and coping skills. So I guess what I'm telling you is, science has researched how to help your kids since as long as we've been psychologists. Have they come up with one system to deal with your children? No, nor will they ever. Once again, this is why we go back. So what are you supposed to do? You do what you're supposed to do, which is go back to the Bible, which is the one unchanging manual of parenting. We're going to talk about this more tomorrow. So you turn to the Bible, which is always right, and it never changes. For example, Proverbs 22:6. Anyone know what that is? Train the child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he won't turn from it. What about Proverbs 23:13? Do not withhold discipline from a child. How about Proverbs 29:15? A child left to himself disgraces his mother. Wow. How about Proverbs 29:17? Discipline your son. Now I'm using these scriptures as examples because not one of those scriptures at the end says, unless your child has ADHD. Not one of them at the end says, unless you have a child on the autistic spectrum. The Bible doesn't qualify special needs children. Therefore, this is God's wisdom to apply to all kids. You know what we tell parents in the office of special needs kids when we're working with them, we're trying to come up with solutions, and Mary and I wish we had all the solutions. Mostly we're working as a team with these parents, and what we end up saying is, you know what? You got to do something. The only thing you can't do is nothing, okay? You got to do something. Yes, parenting a special needs child is much different, more burdensome, let's be honest, than parenting a typical child. But what's your choice? You got to do it. A lot of parents come into our office and they say, we've tried this and we've tried that, and nothing seems to work. So what do? They stop trying anything, which is the worst thing that they can do. So, once again, or they have what I call guilty parent syndrome. This happens a lot with ADHD kids, where Mary and I do a lot of diagnostics, so we test children to figure out what's going on with them. And if we evaluate a child, and sometimes when we say, we really think your child has ADHD and this is what we're going to do about it, and then they get misty-eyed. And I say, what are you crying about? And they say, so you're telling me I've been punishing this child for something he can't control. And they crumble with guilt. And, if a child is neurologically, developmentally, or neurochemically predisposed to something that interferes with their own ability to control themselves, then it's even more important that you establish external control. So what we end up telling parents is, this isn't no, you don't back off on parenting because your child has ADHD. You tighten up your parenting. You become better at this kind of thing. And you got to find something that works. More often, it's a tool bag of things that work. So that's what we're going to try to help you with tonight, is establishing a toolkit for your individual child. Once again, there's no one system. There's no one right or wrong. All we have is the Bible that reminds us of things that every child needs. Does that make sense so far? We, in graduate school, we learned that, psychology school, rats and pigeons, animals, can be trained to do things, trained to behave a certain way. By controlling the circumstances, controlling the environment, you can train an animal to do anything. Now, my thinking has always been, so therefore there's no child that we can't manage, using these behavior techniques. Now, Mary, we've had extensive debate on this question. She says that's an unfair comparison because our kids aren't dumb animals, They have a little thing called free will. So she says, Michael, that's not an apt comparison. You can't keep saying that. But that's kind of the beauty of it, too. That's true. Whatever condition your child has, whatever disorder, that child has the divine spark in him or in her. Whatever that disorder is, if you clear away that disorder, there's the same thing in that child that God values in every other human being on the planet. There's that same thing in that child that God values in us, that God finds desirous for us, is in your child. It just may take a different path to get to it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, and I also don't want you to think tonight, we're going to be talking about behavior and discipline and things like that. I don't want you to think I'm saying, oh, your life is so burdensome. It's just one trial after another, because we know that's not true either. We know that every one of you parents could come up here and tell a wonderful story of victory, of breakthrough, of something your child did that made you choke up in your throat and bring a tear to your eye. So it's not like, I don't want to make it sound like we're just talking about the misery of being a parent of a special needs child by any means. And speaking of God, there's a reason that your child was put with you. You must be the perfect parents for this child. Now, I don't know how God figured that out, but do you believe that? It's true. You were the parents selected to raise this special needs child. The fact that you're here trying to learn tells you something about that. So once again, we admire you greatly. And not every, there are great things of these disorders we're going to talk about. Some of the most interesting kids I've ever worked with are kids on the spectrum, on the autistic spectrum. They're kind of my favorite, some of my favorite kids to do therapy with are the really high-functioning autistic spectrum boys in particular. Why? Because they get obsessively interested in things. Oh, who could that be exactly like? So Mary sometimes hears me in therapy doing therapy with a boy on the spectrum, and we're having a big debate about superheroes or Minecraft, And Mary will peek her head in and she'll say, "Is that really therapeutic?" And I'm like, "No, we're just building rapport here." But I seem to have so much in common with those kids. Some of the funniest kids I've ever met are kids with ADHD because, I don't know, they and I share in common a little problem with impulse control. So I totally relate to them. Some of the most creative kids I've ever met are kids with mood disorders. So not only are you perfectly suited for your child, but your child has some wonderful things in him or her like that that make you a good match, and that give you hope, and that keep you going when you're exhausted and you think this is the worst day I've ever had. Just remember that. Your child has this divine spark, and there are great things about every child. Mary's going to give you some more practicals, but one thing we want to make sure is that you're experts at your child's disorder. You know, that you've trained which I'm sure you have, Googled everything you can find on autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, mood disorders. I'm sure you've done extensive research. But just to lay some groundwork, I want to go through each of these little areas real quickly and tell you a little bit about the cause of them, the typical treatment for them, and then we'll move on from there. So let's start with ADHD. Let me first tell you the proper nosology, the proper term for this disorder, because it's changed so much over the years. Back when Mary and I started, there was a name for kids with ADHD. This is when they weren't sure ADHD existed yet. So it was minimal brain dysfunction. This takes us back to the 70s, in the early 80s, minimal brain dysfunction. How politically correct would that be now, right? So it was that. Then for a while it was hyperkinesis. Then for a while, then they came up with attention. You know, what we found out as psychologists is the longer and more complicated a term is for a disorder, the more we can charge for it. Therefore, it behooves us to complicate these titles as much as we possibly can. So if you want to be current, modern parents of an ADHD kid, everything now, there's no such thing. I was telling Charlie at dinner, there's no such thing as ADD anymore. So we do interviews with parents and we take a family history and they say, well, I have a cousin who was it ADHD or ADD? And I say, oh, it's all one thing now. So everything is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Then you specify a subtype. There's the primarily inattentive subtype, which is the kids that aren't hyperactive. They're just the space cadets, you know, that lose focus. Then there's the predominantly impulsive hyperactive type. And then there's the most common one, the combined type, which is prevalent in, it's 75% more common in boys than in girls, the combined subtype of ADHD. So go figure, a lot of you wives are going, oh, that explains it, with your arm around your husband. Either way, the defining characteristic of ADHD is developmentally inappropriate levels of inattention, impulsiveness, and hyperactivity. Now, you already know that, but one thing I want you to know in addition is that key term, developmentally inappropriate. Technically, you can't label a kid ADHD if the levels of hyperactivity, impulsiveness, and inattention they show, if it's normal for their mental age. Does that make sense? So if you have a child who's developmentally delayed, who may be a 12-year-old but acts more like a 7-year-old because of his mental development, if he shows the level of hyperactivity, inattention, and impulsivity you'd expect of a normal 7-year-old, then technically you wouldn't call him ADHD. So I'm telling you this because this title of ADHD is so controversial. And this is one reason why. Because you have to gauge ADHD relative to a kid's development, relative to his developmental level. For that reason, we never make the diagnosis of ADHD without doing a good developmental assessment. Does that make sense? Because if a kid comes in who's hyperactive, impulsive, or inattentive, but we find out there's a global developmental delay, that would change the way we would go about treatment. The other thing that makes ADHD such a controversial diagnosis is, in a kid, everything looks like ADHD. Almost every other disorder you can imagine looks like ADHD. Take depression, for example. Kids who are depressed, adults, we know what depression looks like in adults. They get vegetative, they cry, they want to keep the blanket over their head all day. In kids, it's just the opposite. Kids, when they get depressed, they get hyperactive, inattentive, and impulsive. Kids who are anxious get hyperactive, inattentive. Kids who've not had good parenting are hyperactive, inattentive, and impulsive. Everything in a kid looks like ADHD, which is why it's so often misdiagnosed and why there's so many kids on medication, which I'll talk about in a second, that shouldn't be. So what I'm telling you is a diagnosis of ADHD can't be made bedside, as it were. It can't be made by a teacher. It can't even be made by a pediatrician who sees your child for 10 minutes. God bless them, and pediatricians are some of our best referral sources. A pediatrician in the office can't sit a kid on his cold metal aluminum table in the little, where he's shivering and say, no, your kid doesn't look hyperactive to me. It can't be done that way. A proper diagnosis of ADHD has to be made after a full evaluation and after carefully ruling out any of these other things, these million other things that could be ADHD that are not. Because once again, if a kid looks like ADHD, but it's one of these other disorders, if you treat them with, for example, some of the medications you would for ADHD, it might make them worse. So what I'm saying is, this disorder does exist. A lot of people still doubt that. We know it exists. It's just confused with a million other things. So be skeptical of that diagnosis unless a proper evaluation has been done. When Mary and I evaluate kids for ADHD, we very carefully take a full family history, social history, developmental history, family history. Then we look at a lot of areas of development. We do intelligence testing, we do academic testing, we do specific tests of attention and concentration, then we test emotional functioning to rule out any of these other things. So this is a very complex diagnosis, and it shouldn't be made capriciously by just anyone. So that caution, a lot of nodding heads means you've already been through this. The other thing to keep in mind is ADHD is also a spectrum disorder. People used to think you either have it or you don't. But there's all different levels of ADHD as well. There's mild, moderate, axe murderer, heinous. It's on a spectrum as well. You can have symptoms of it, and you can have mild symptoms of it, moderate, severe symptoms. So all of that makes it a confounding diagnosis. We think we know a lot about what causes ADHD. There are two parts of your brain. Maybe I should have had a PowerPoint, but there's one part of your brain, you may know this already, in the frontal lobes, the very frontmost part of your brain, that exerts an inhibitory influence on the rest of the brain. It helps you control your behavior. Don't let me get started. I'm a neuropsychologist by training, so I get all excited about this. So one theory is that it's the frontal lobes, this part that helps you control yourself, is underdeveloped. There's another part of your brain called the reticular formation that stimulates your brain. It comes up through the spinal cord and it spreads all out through the cerebral cortex, which is the thinking part of your brain, and its job is to make you awake and alert and focused. If you do something to your spinal cord to show you what happens and that reticular formation is damaged, you have just the opposite, which is a comatose state. So this part of your brain, its job is to make you alert and focused. We think it's underdevelopment or malformation of these parts of the brain, which is why we give our kids with ADHD stimulant medications, because it stimulates. So many parents come in and the first thing they say is, if you find out my kid has ADHD, I will not let you put him on medication, because it's going to make him a zombie. Or, more often we hear, my aunt's brother's third cousin was on such and such medication. It made him a zombie. I'm never going to let you put him on medication. So I explain these medications aren't sedatives or barbiturates, they're stimulants to make that brain work effectively. So in terms of treatment, there's always the M word, medication. The reason stimulants are a double-edged sword. One of the good things about them is they're very short-acting, as many of you parents already know. So the stimulants that we use for ADHD, Concerta, Focalin, Vyvanse, Metadate, there's a zillion of them now. Back in the day there was Ritalin, but now there's a whole cornucopia of stimulants. They all do essentially the same thing. The big difference is how long they last and the mechanism they use to make their effect extend. So the beauty of the stimulants is they get into the body pretty quickly. And I tell parents when we talk about medication, I said, you're going to know in 20 minutes what this does. Then, in 5 hours max, maybe 6, it's gone. So the double-edged sword is you're going to show quick benefit, and we're going to know pretty soon if we made the right choice. The other benefit is it's not like there's something in this child's body all the time, because in a few hours it's gone. Therefore, provided you can tolerate this child, you don't have to give it on the weekends, you don't have to give it spring break, all summer, 3-day holiday. You don't have to give it all the time, and that makes parents feel better when we say that. Now, we also tell parents, don't be a martyr either. If you're going to church and you need your child to behave for a few hours, or if you're going to grandma's house and she has a Wedgwood china collection, you definitely want to, So that's a good thing about the medications we use. The same benefit, the short-actingness of it, is also a liability. Because a lot of your kids on stimulants, when it comes out of the body, you experience a rebound. Have you heard this term? So if you have these skinny little kids with high metabolisms, usually boys, and they burn through this medication really quickly, when medication starts wearing off, for a while they'll get worse. And you say, what is this monstrosity I brought home from school? Or they get emotionally fragile and start crying. So usually for those kids we can use it, especially for middle schoolers and kids older than that. When they get home and the medication's all worn off, but they still have an hour of homework to do, we usually give a booster dose of a shorter acting, something like methylphenidate that's shorter acting, that'll push them through the homework hour. So I want to, Christians still have trouble with the concept of medication. We're going to talk about this more tomorrow. But that's what it's there for. And some of these kids, I tell parents, medication is a cost-to-benefit ratio decision. No one wants to medicate a child, no question about it. But let's look at the cost and the benefit. What's the cost if you don't medicate this child? His school performance is going to continue to go down. He's going to get frustrated with school. He's going to get in trouble all the time. So he's going to get a reputation. None of the kids are going to want to be around him. So I encourage parents to think of it that way. Now, what's the benefit we could get from this? So I just thought we'd broach the medication issue. Mary, who is much wiser than I, will talk in a few minutes about behavioral things we can do, but I thought we had to cross that medication line. One thing I do want to say about behavioral approaches for ADHD, there is one big key, is one thing that your frontal lobes do for you is help you sequence behavior. If you have something to do, your frontal lobes help you break that task down into steps. That's what it's for. Kids with ADHD who have underactive frontal lobes, when you tell them to do something, all they see is this huge mountain, and they have no clue how to break it down into steps. When I'm testing a kid with ADHD, and I give them some of the tests they do on their own, like if we're doing academic testing, I give them a math worksheet. I can see their little eyes go right to the end. The first thing they look at is how many problems are on this, and then they look like, they've had a shell blow up next to them or something like that. So what we encourage parents to do is, that little brain can't break things down into steps. You have to do that for your child. The example I always use is to clean your room. If you tell a kid with ADHD, go clean your room, they're going to walk into that room and see that mountain that they can't overcome. You're going to go up there 2 hours later, and he's going to be sitting there playing with G.I. Joe or, Pokemon cards. So everything has to be broken down into little, tiny, doable steps. Instead of saying, go clean your room, say, go put away your socks, then come back. Or even if it has to be smaller than that, go find all your white socks. Good, now come back, here's a cookie. Now go, or a less red dye processed sugar snack, Now go put away all your blue socks. Now go put away your pants. Everything has to be broken down into little teeny pieces. Even the homework issue, you cannot, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, you can't tell an ADHD kid, now you sit right there until all that homework is done. Because they see that same mountain, So in the office, we work with parents on breaking down, if your kid comes home with 10 pages of homework, you take 9 of them and get them out of his sight. You have one. If that one page has 10 math problems on it, you say, we're going to cover up 9 of these. All you have to worry about, see that one problem? That's all you have to worry about for 5 minutes. And I might even give you a little timer. 5 minutes. Then I'm going to set that timer for another 5 minutes, and you can go play Grand Theft Auto. No, I'm sorry. That's not what I meant. You can go do something else. We're going to talk about that tomorrow too. Then come back, another 5 minutes, next problem. So it's and I'll tell that to parents in the office, and they'll say, well, that's going to take forever to do their homework. And I say, how long does it take now? Oh, kind of forever. So the whole thing, even in adults with ADHD, the whole thing is breaking. For our college-age patients, we teach them how to, if you have a chapter to read each night, you take a rubber band and you put it around the last, all but one page. You read this page over and over again if you have to, and then get up and walk around, come back, next page. So it's breaking everything down into small, measurable pieces and rewarding on-task time with off-task time. Now you can even have that built into, you all know what a 504 plan may be, is special concessions you can ask of your school to put in place for your ADHD child. You can ask in the 504 plan to have things broken down, like, when they take a test, only 10 minutes at a time, and then they can get up for 10 minutes and walk around. You can ask for these same concessions legally under a 504 plan of your school. So, like I said, Mary's going to give some more practicals. Let's talk about autism spectrum disorder for a while. That's another thing where, what happened to that term? Back in the day, autism, when we talk about autistic children, it drummed up a certain image, right? Back in the day, it was always the most severely impaired autistic children who had very, stereotypic behavior and self-stimulatory behavior, and they couldn't communicate, and usually those kids were also mentally retarded as well, mentally handicapped. Since then, mental health professionals have gotten much wiser about autism. We don't even call it, here's another, bring you into the 21st century, there's no such thing as Asperger's anymore. Asperger's used to be the term for high-functioning autism. No such thing as that anymore. If I were Asperger, I'd be pretty angry about that. I'd be rolling over in my grave saying, I invented this thing. You're taking it away from me? But I think that's wise. So now everything is on the autism spectrum. But that encompasses a huge range of different kids. But they all have certain things in common, And like I said, some of my most interesting patients are the really, really highly intelligent, high-functioning autistic kids. They're so interesting to me. But most autistic kids anywhere on the spectrum have things in common. For example, their tendency to obsess over one thing, which they will talk about and do to the exclusion of almost everything else. You guys know what Minecraft is? Yes. Minecraft, to the autistic child, is cocaine. I'm just saying. It's the cocaine of autism. If you introduce Minecraft to an autistic child, be ready, because there's going to have to be an intervention and a 12-step program at some point in their future. It kind of appeals to their own world, which I can control absolutely and be creative in any way I want. So there's still, thank goodness for my autistic spectrum patients, because they keep me up with what's in and what isn't, Like, I didn't know Pokemon was still a thing, or Yu-Gi-Oh! Is still a thing, or Magic cards are still a thing. I didn't know that. Thank goodness they come in and inform me every so often. So they have a tendency to focus on certain things to the exclusion of others. They have social problems, being socially awkward, being egocentric, not being able to be empathetic or to understand the positions of others. A lot of them have language, they're not language impaired, but they have unusual or what we call atypical language. So they all have something in common. And most of them have a need for routine and order, right? Everything has to be the same. And if things aren't the same, you precipitate these meltdowns, which in little kids can be very big meltdowns, right? But even as kids get older, kids on the spectrum who are teenagers, they still have their meltdowns, don't they? They take a different form. There's not so much throwing yourself on the floor, kicking and screaming, but they have their little fits, don't they, when their routine is disrupted. So those are the commonalities in all kids on the autism spectrum. Now, in terms of the cause of this, we think it's the opposite of ADHD. ADHD, go back to that reticular formation that makes the brain alert and attentive. We think in ADHD kids, that part of the brain is underactive. In kids with autism, we think it's overactive. So that they're attentive to everything. You know how you and I can sit here and you can listen to me, we're not too disturbed by the light, by the noise, the projector, by the, someone walks in. With kids on the spectrum, because their little nervous systems are so tightly ratcheted up, they can't screen out anything. So everything is this barrage of stimulation all the time, which is why they prefer things that are regular, predictable, routine, and that they can use to shut out everything else. So that's also why they have sensory, a lot of your kids on the spectrum have sensory sensitivities. They don't like certain clothing. They don't like the tags in their shirts, the seams in their socks. They don't eat certain foods because they don't like the texture. It's all because of this tightly wound reticular formation that makes them oversensitive to everything. Now, once again, to keep in mind, like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder is a spectrum disorder. Once again, you can have mild, moderate, severe. You can have, if you look at the new, you've heard of the DSM-5 maybe? Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's the cookbook all mental health professionals use to make a diagnosis. So in the DSM-5, they judge the severity of your autism spectrum disorder by how much support your child needs. That's a very fair way of doing it. And you say this child needs support in social communication, or maybe he needs support because of his restrictive range of interests. So we're getting more sophisticated in defining these kids and labeling them, if you will. And I think that's a good thing. Now, in terms of treatment, once again, Mary will go over some important behavioral things. Treatment, the M word, also applies to autism spectrum disorder, medication, but it's not the same as medicating a kid with ADHD. Most kids with autism spectrum disorder don't respond to medications in any way that you would find predictable. They seem to react differently to almost everything, so they're a challenge to come up with for medication. And you may find this hard to believe, but psychiatry is not an exact science. Gasp. It is a trial and error art form that you go through trial and error. So you may have to try something, and if it doesn't work, try something else, and then if that doesn't work, try something else. Now, most of my high-functioning autism spectrum disorder patients are on an antidepressant because it takes the edge, it seems to take the edge off their irritability. You know, that intolerance that they have, and everything irritates them if it's not just the way they want it to be. Sometimes an antidepressant can take the edge off of that. Sometimes antipsychotic like Risperdal. Actually, Risperdal is one of the few medications that has an indication, an on-label indication for treating the irritability of autism spectrum disorder. So it's actually an approved medication for ASD. There's a shock. So there are different things. Then there's also the beta blockers, 10x, clonidine, things that you usually use for aggressive behavior. So there's lots of different medications you can try, but once again, it's not a science, it's more of an art. Behaviorally, I'll say this blanket statement. Most approaches that you'd use for a normal kid are definitely not going to work in kids with autism spectrum disorder. Mary and I will spend a whole class tomorrow talking about corporal punishment. I generally am going to tell any of you parents with autistic kids to for that hour, go get a coffee or watch TV, because it mostly won't apply. Because in kids with autism spectrum disorder, it can just add to their aggravation and their meltdowns and their temper tantrums. It's more effective for them to use removal of privileges, taking things away, particularly Minecraft and screen time. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. Finally, of course, with autistic kids, you do want to encourage them to do something pro-social. Because if you don't, if you let them have their way, they will lock themselves in their room and play Minecraft all day, right? So even if it's anything, in Athens, Georgia, where we are from, they actually have an anime club. Amen to that. Because every autistic kid will go to that anime. There's a Lego club. A Lego club. I tried to get in, but I didn't make the age requirement. I would totally go to Lego club. It's like my favorite thing to do. So anything pro-social, because what we say about kids on the spectrum is they don't have to be the most popular social person in the world. They'll never be the most popular social person in the world. But if they can establish one reasonably deep friendship with anyone, even if it's another kid on the spectrum, that's what we're going for. That may be all they need. Now, your high-functioning kids on the spectrum, you know what's going to happen? If they have really high IQs, they're going to go to college. They're going to find a cluster of nerds. They're going to flourish in that social cluster of nerds. They're going to become math or physics professors and live happily ever after. I have two nephews that are twins that are they're the most intelligent organisms I've ever seen on this planet, and it was the same thing. They found a little. I thought they would never fit in socially with anything anywhere, and when they went to Duke University, they found a science fraternity. It was like if you could make the perfect, now they never left there in 4 years. They stayed in that little building and ventured out only for classes. But now one of them, ended up getting his PhD in computer engineering and now works for AMD and is making bokus of money. But what does he do with his free time? He plays magic cards and Dungeons and Dragons. But it doesn't matter. So what I tell when we make an initial diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, I say, listen, this is not a death sentence. This is not a death knell. I know plenty of kids on the spectrum, especially if they're high functioning, that end up doing just wonderfully. We just got to get them through the 12 years of school. If we can get them through that, they may live happily ever after. Lastly, let me talk a little bit about mood disorders like depression. Once again, this is another one that's often misdiagnosed because, again, like I said, depression in kids looks completely different than it does in adults. In kids, little kids, depression, mood disorders are characterized by these off-the-chain tantrums that seem to be precipitated by nothing. And this kid has this way out of proportion, off-the-chain, total meltdown. And when you're saying, what is this all about? Get we need a lion tamer and a whip and a chair, and then all of a sudden it goes away, and the child acts like it never happened. And you're like, what just happened? And that happens several times a day. And once again, you see how that might be mistaken for ADHD. But that kind of off-the-chain tantruming for little obvious reason is often indicative of depression in kids. There is now another diagnosis I'd like to get you familiar with. It's called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. You ever hear that? Disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. We used to say these kids had little kid bipolar disorder, but it's way too early to call a kid bipolar. So thank goodness they came up with this other category, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, which is a little junior depression in training. The profile is these kids that have these big meltdowns and these big tantrums for nothing. Now, let me talk about the whole issue of depression in a kid. What does a kid have to be depressed about? You may wonder if your child has a diagnosis of depression. You say, what? He's a kid. What is he depressed about? Like, what Pokemon character no longer exists, or. But this goes again to the cause. We know a lot about depression being caused by deficiencies of certain neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals in your brain that let nerve cells talk to each other. We know some of those chemicals that are deficient. Now, unfortunately, you can't, for example, serotonin, maybe you've heard of that, is a neurochemical that's implicated in depression. Unfortunately, you can't take a serotonin pill because it doesn't cross something called the blood-brain barrier, which is your brain's system to protect the brain from toxic things. What you can use is medications that become serotonin later or that influence the production of serotonin in the brain. So I'm telling you all that to say, be open to the idea of medication in a kid with depression or a mood disorder, because it's dealing with the part of this they can't control, which is the biochemical part of it. For example, you've heard of the SSRIs, Prozac, Paxil, Lexapro, things like that. They regulate the reuptake of serotonin in the brain. Now, let me quickly say, you probably have seen the commercials on TV, right, for these antidepressants? And what do they always say? Yeah, that's true. Why would any pharmacy company advertise on TV? Because they're required to put every side effect that ever happened in one lab rat. So who would buy any of those medications, You could die if you take this medication. And don't take it with food, water, or any other, It's like, I totally do not want to take this medication anymore. But in some of these SSRIs, they do this black box warning at the end, may cause suicidal impulses in children and adolescents. Now that's true, but for reasons different than they explain it on TV. Sometimes kids can be suicidal in a manipulative fashion. Sometimes they're bound and determined to try to commit suicide, but they're so vegetative they can't do it until they're on an antidepressant. And then they feel better and they say, oh good, now I can do this. So I'm telling you all that to say be open to the idea of medication if your child has a mood disorder. But once again, this is not a diagnosis that can be made capriciously without doing a really good evaluation first. Now, there are lots of behavioral treatments as well. We've been focusing on medication. For all these disorders, mood disorders, autism, ADHD, there's lots of behavioral treatments. Cognitive behavior therapy, applied behavior analysis. There's a million different mindfulness. There's a zillion different therapies. Let me just say about the role of medication. I usually tell parents that a child won't benefit optimally from a strictly behavioral therapy until we relieve the symptoms a little with medication. Does that make sense? So I don't want you to think I'm representing big pharma here, urging you to put your kids on medication. What I will tell you is, sometimes until you lift the cloud of depression, or you settle the impulsiveness of ADHD, or you take the edge off the irritability of a kid with autism spectrum disorder, you're not going to get maximum benefit from these therapies. So that's why we say one approach works, medication, the other approach, therapy, works. None of them alone work as well as both of them together. So there is a place for medication. We'll talk about more about that tomorrow. Now, that's all the philosophical, neurological, scientific stuff. Now for the practical part, I'll give you my wise wife.
I'm not going to give you guys a lot of specifics tonight because, as Michael said, each of your children is so different. So they're not, I can't give you the 10 things to do if your child has been diagnosed with an autistic spectrum disorder, because each child is so different. So what I want to do is just give you some concepts or some principles to think about. The first is, if your child has been diagnosed with some type of disorder, don't rearrange your whole life around the child's disorder. That's what you want to do as a parent, right? Your child has been diagnosed with something and you want to try to rearrange the home and the world so that this child doesn't have to meet the challenges that they have to meet with that disorder. That doesn't benefit your child. You know, the whole world is not going to be different, be rearranged because your child has some type of issue or some type of challenges. So your job as a parent is to, as much as possible, try to help your child adjust to the world instead. Does that make sense? You know, and that includes home. You know, you need to try to make your home as normal as you possibly can. Now, you know, if you have a child with severe autism, there's going to be some limitations on that, right? You know, but as much as possible, you want to try to get your child to adjust to the world as it is, because that's the world they're going to have to live in eventually. You know, I work with this great family. These are my favorite parents in the world, I think. There's a couple very, you know, very country folks. You know, they live out on a farm. They have adopted 17 children out of the foster care system. Whoa. 17. Now you can imagine, you name a diagnosis, they got 4 of them in that house, you know? I mean, you can imagine the list of diagnoses that these kids have. But these parents, their expectation is, and most of these children, by the way, they adopted older, you know, like middle elementary school age. The expectation that with these folks is that when they come, these children come into their home, they're going to adjust to their home and the rest of the family. They're going to adjust to their new school. They're going to adjust to the church that they go to. You know, now, you know, their days are not perfect, you can imagine. I mean, they've had every kind of crisis you can possibly go through. But in the long run, that's exactly what these 17 kids have done. Regardless of whether they had ADHD or LD or depression, or they met those expectations of that family. You know, now these are wonderful parents. I mean, these are great, great parents. But you know, that's really impressed me to see these kids, a lot of them who had very severe disorders when they came into that home, but they met that expectation that I'm gonna adjust to a normal family and a normal home and going to school every day. I'm gonna adjust to the world. So that's what you want to communicate to your child. I wanted to talk just a minute about disciplining a child with special needs. As Michael said, you know, it is not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. You know, the first thing you need to do, and I think Michael mentioned this, is you need to become an expert not only at what your child's disorder is, but of your child as a person and how they react to things, how they respond to things. What helps them to calm down when they're having one of these meltdown temper tantrums? You know, what makes it worse? You know, what can you take away that really has an impact on them if you're talking about them losing privileges? You need to become an expert at how your child responds to different forms of discipline. The other thing you have to do is you've got to get creative. You know, talk to their teachers, talk to their therapists, talk to their doctors, come up with as many ideas as you can and try them. You know, now what you don't want to do is you don't want to try one thing on one day and one thing on the other day. You know, when we do interviews with parents, we say, you know, what kind of discipline have you tried at home? Well, I tried timeout and that didn't work. And we tried spanking, but that made things worse. But what they're talking about is I tried it twice and nothing. I saw no effects from it. You know, with a child that doesn't have any of these issues, you might do a discipline twice and see some effect from it. But with a child with any of these issues, it may be a dozen times before you see an effect. You know, you may have to put that child in timeout a dozen times before you see any kind of response whatsoever. Because just like they miss things in school, they miss things in discipline as well. ADHD children, you better decide this is what we're going to do every time this child does it, and then you better just expect it to be a long haul, because it's going to be more than a dozen times before you see any change in that child's behavior. So I'm not talking about jumping from one to another very quickly, but I'm talking about making a plan that this is what we're going to do every time this child does this. And we're going to try it for a while to see if this has an effect on that behavior. Regardless of their disorder or challenges, whatever they're facing, consistency is the key in discipline. It is with kids that don't have any special needs. Consistency is the key. You want to sit down with your spouse or like I said, involve the teachers and the therapists and say, these are the two biggest behaviors that we're having problems with right now. Now, there may be 25 behaviors that you would like to see changed, but don't do that. 2, all right? These are, we call them target behaviors, all right? 2 behaviors that we have really, really got to work on. And so you make a plan before it happens that when this child has one of these meltdowns, this is what we're going to do. We're going to put him in his room. We're going to, keep him there until he's calmed down. Then we're going to try to talk to him after it's over with and see what would be a better way for him to handle it, And then you keep at it until you see some progress in those 2 behaviors. Then you pick 2 more, Now, you may be working on those 2 behaviors for a year or longer. But you're making progress if you're doing that. So it's that kind of consistency and that kind of being prepared. If your child is at a maturity level or intellectual level where they can engage with you, you need to sit down with them and say, here's our plan. This is what we're going to work on. We got to get rid of those temper tantrums. I mean, you're miserable, we're miserable. We got to get rid of those. So here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to try to help you get those under control. So they are part of that. They know what's coming too. That's the kind of consistency I'm talking about. Where we get in trouble with kids, and especially kids with special needs, is they have these behaviors that are sometimes very inappropriate. And we're trying to think off the top of our head, what in the world am I going to do about this? That's why discipline doesn't work a lot of times. It's because we haven't sat down and made up this plan to be consistent about how we address their behaviors. No matter what your child has been diagnosed with, remember that there is a normal kid in there, and they're going to do normal kid stuff. They're going to lie to you like a normal kid. They're going to disobey you like a normal kid. Now again, this is all on the spectrum. If you have a child that's very severely impaired, you may see less of that. But there's a normal kid in there that's going to do normal kid stuff that you've got to address as a parent. You've got to get very good at kind of weeding out what is the disorder, what is the ADHD, the behaviors that are ADHD related, and what is normal kid behavior that I need to address as a parent. Right. For instance, if you have a child with ADHD, you don't spank them because they can't sit through dinner at the dinner table. You don't do that. That's the ADHD, all right? That's why he's got that diagnosis. He can't sit through dinner at the dinner table. You don't discipline for that, but if he's defiant to you, that you discipline for. So you've got to figure out what is what here. Kids with special needs have a sinful nature too. Just like all the rest of us in this room, all right? They've got one too. And as a parent, you've got to know the difference. What's the disorder and what is the sinful nature that I've got to try to address. The other thing, and we forget to do this a lot of times, especially with children who have a lot of needs, don't forget to tell them, train them in what the appropriate behavior is. Sometimes if we're dealing with a child that has a lot of behavioral issues, we're so focused on trying to get that behavior under control that we forget to tell them this is what you're supposed to do in that situation. All the kids we just mentioned, kids with learning disabilities even, which we didn't talk about, kids with ADHD, kids with autism, they miss social cues, They don't pick up the cues that other people pick up, because of what they're dealing with, So they may be acting out at the store because nobody ever told them what it is you're supposed to act like at the store. We actually I have a written sheet in my office, good behavior in public places, and teaching the parents how to teach the child before you go into Walmart, this is what we're going to do. This is what you can do and what you can't do. If you do this, this is what's going to happen. Are you ready to try the store? Okay, let's try the store. We forget to train them like that. We forget to train them about how to make friends at school. We forget to train them about, what's appropriate to say when you meet a stranger and what's not appropriate. You know what I'm saying? We get so focused on the behaviors, trying to get the inappropriate behaviors under control, that we forget to teach them what the appropriate behaviors are.
Don't go anywhere.
All right.
I want to add one more thing about if you are married, if you're a team here, if you're a husband and wife with a child with special needs, we want to really emphasize working on your marriage and
Yes.
preserving your marriage, because your marriage is under an unusual amount of strain, not common to most people. And you're going to be tempted to say, no one really understands what we're going through here, so no one can help us in our marriage. Look around the room. I presume you all know each other. You've got someone right next to you that can help you. Not only seeking advice, but also providing respite care. Because let me tell you, if the wheels of your marriage fall off, this whole thing's going to go,
Right.
yeah, okay? So you want to do everything you can to prioritize, just like we're going to talk about tomorrow with typical kids, to make sure your marriage is in a good place despite this strain. And you're going to have to develop a team. It takes a village to raise a child, especially with a special needs kid. Not only do you have your favorite doctor, your favorite psychiatrist, favorite psychologist, your therapist, your special ed teacher, this is part of your team, but you want to form a team in your family too. Please make sure you get away
Yes.
and get some respite time to devote to your marriage. And you might say, that's reversing priorities. We've got to put everything we've got into this child. Once again, if you don't put everything you got into your marriage, this child is not going to have, it's going to be much harder. So please be open to, and this is something else. When you talk to parents of typical children, and you try to explain what you're going through, please forgive them for saying something stupid.
Stupid things.
Because they have no clue. It's the same thing when you're grieving, there's been a death in the family. It's really hard to think of something really appropriate to say that doesn't sound like it came off a Hallmark card. So please forgive them. Explain to them, your best friends in church who have typical kids, please explain to them what it's like, what you're going through, and then ask them for help. And it might be good to educate them too about some of these things. But please do everything you can to have time to yourself, to preserve your marriage, to commit to the family.